thank you everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Sydney, Australia. Loving it. The weather is beautiful, the people are great, and I've had a really good week here. And kind of sad it's coming to an end. But anyway, thank you all for taking the time and being here for my presentation today. So, the talk today I'm going to be doing is about how we have less in common with the future and the past, and we're closer to the future than the past in many ways. I'm going to take this off here. So, what I mean by that is from a technological standpoint, right? All of us, no matter where we're born in history, whether it's the year 2024, 2124, or the year 24, all of us have different biases of where the world we're born in, the world we're living in, the world our parents lived in, and so today I kind of want to give a different perspective. So I'm making this presentation today from the year 2140. I'm not here in 2024. I'm coming from 100 years in the future back to today, trying to communicate the importance of Bitcoin, the importance of energy abundance, and the importance of technological change and exponential curves. So it's been very nice to travel from America to Australia and also over the last 100 years here. So you have less in common with the near future than the distant past, at least in my perspective, coming from the future to you here, is that in the same way you all would have difficulty explaining to someone from 200 years ago, 1824, what the world looks like. In my view, it's very much the same way. Innovation was twice as fast over the last 100 years from where you are today, 2024 to 2124. And so in many ways, it's like the same thing, right? In the same way you'd have trouble explaining to someone living in a log cabin what a Zoom call is. It's very much the same way. So, the last 632 years, from the discovery of America, or quote-unquote discovery of America, by Christopher Columbus. I was born in the late 21st century, and then, of course, my year is 2124. You guys are in orange. Of course, orange, why not? 2024. All the way back every century, back and back a little bit, with 1492 being cut off at the end. And so this is energy. This is a chart of energy production and consumption of the human race up to 2024. Your point in time, the current day where we are right now. It's a pretty exponential chart, right? And of course, we're biased from where we are today to look back and think, oh, well, it's only been the last couple hundred years that this growth has really accelerated, right? And everything before that was pretty flat. Humanity didn't really do anything until suddenly we woke up one day 200 years ago and decided, let's get to building stuff, right? But the reality is that that's not how it worked. It's been an exponential curve for thousands of years, and it's just only we're seeing the last iteration because we think in logarithmic scales, because we live in logarithmic scales. We have our timelines at the bottom, right? This blue bar here. We have it in a linear scale, and we look up at energy production, consumption, and population in linear scales. And I think that gives us an accurate view of the past, and also makes trying to understand and even conceptualize the future essentially impossible because we can't even really visualize it. So that's the future. That's me. That little red slice is my life. I'm only 24 years old, born at the end of the 21st century. And even in my lifetime, the amount of energy that has been produced by humanity has dramatically increased. In fact, it's roughly doubled. Here in 2024, it's been the last 40, 45 years or so that the amount of energy has doubled for the planet. But in 100 years, a simple doubling takes even shorter periods of time, and that's how it's probably going to continue in the future. I'm pretty young, got a lot of years to live, so if we're looking backwards, getting back up to today, where we are, 2024, 1492, Christopher Columbus, quote-unquote, discovers America, sails the Atlantic Ocean. A few weeks ago, I got to see a replica of the Santa Maria, and I cannot believe how far we've come in just a few hundred years. It's absolutely amazing. So, 1492, a few hundred years later, of course, or barely 100 years later, we have the discovery of Australia, where we are right now, right, in Sydney, Australia. So, really, it's amazing to think, as an American, how recent the discovery of America was, and it's just mind-blowing that your big island over here, your continent, was even so much more recent than that of America. And I think Americans don't even really, we talk about how, America's so young, but Australia is even significantly younger than that. But Australia was not the last continent to be discovered. It was actually Antarctica in 1820. So I suppose for a little bit of context, from here today to Antarctica, we've only known of Antarctica's existence for barely, in your time frame, 200 years, from me 300 years. That's not a long time. 1820, that's only 40 years before the American Civil War. Barely 100 years later, the computer would be invented, which we'll get to in just a moment. To me, that's absolutely incredible that we had this whole continent at the bottom of the earth and we didn't have the technology to realize, oh, it existed, right? And it was significantly later, after 1820, that people actually explored the interior of Antarctica. Then we have Bitcoin. I know it's a little counterintuitive, but Nikola Tesla, in this paper here, The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, made the very first description of Bitcoin, at least that I can find, in 1899. So, which is funny enough because Australia, 1901, right? So in many ways, the idea of Bitcoin's existence is older than that of Australia, if you really want to get in the weeds and think about it that way. Obviously, that's not when Bitcoin was invented. That was just the first conceptualization of Bitcoin. Of course, you have the computer in 1948, and of course, you have then Bitcoin in 2009. And here we are today, 15 years later, March 23rd, 2024, when we're having this discussion, having this presentation right now. So it's amazing how so much of that blue bar, so much of our timeline has been just discovering the very basic building blocks, like what are the continents that we can build society on. And then we found, oh, we have this idea of increasing human energy, we have this idea of the computer, of the internet, and now we have Bitcoin, or at least for you, it's the early days of Bitcoin adoption. Now, this is both an optimistic thing, a happy thing, right? Happy little penguin on the screen, right? It's also a pessimistic thing, right? That's why I like to say, the future is not necessarily better than the past. It's not necessarily worse than the past. Is more different than the past, right? So what on earth is this guy doing up there, speaking of Antarctica and South Africa, Argentina, the bottom half of the world where we are here in Australia? The reason I have this guy on the screen is because, unfortunately for me, coming from the future here, these penguins went extinct in 2035. Where you are today in 2024, their population has fallen by about 99%. They have about 1% to go, and they went extinct in 2035, unfortunately. So my point is that these penguins, it doesn't matter if you're an optimist or a pessimist, these penguins and many other species on the planet, the leopards, the tigers, the lions, the elephants, all these species have less in common with their futures than their past, right? It doesn't matter if you're a pessimist and you think they are going to go extinct. They have less in common with the future than the past. It doesn't matter if you're an optimist and you think for the first time in human history we're going to have an increasing population of these guys instead of decreasing. Like, it doesn't matter which way you think. Inherently, there's more in common with the past than with the future, right? The same thing is true with human population. We have an exploding population where we are today, it's 8 billion people. Where I come from is significantly more, and a few hundred years ago it was much less than that. But no matter what, either we have less in common with the human population growing to a larger level than we've ever seen before, and therefore we need less in common with the energy sources they need than what we had in the past, or we have to assume that something negative is going to happen. It's going to be something destructive, right? So, and that's the stakes of Bitcoin. That's the stakes of this energy abundance argument, is that either way, no matter if you're an optimist or a pessimist, there's going to be a significant amount of change ahead of us. Now, a few days ago from this discussion here, you had the third launch of Starship. Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, they just launched a Starship, right? And I cannot emphasize how significant this innovation is, this discovery it is. It is absolutely incredible how the comparison between the amount of mass to orbit between this essentially cruise ship being launched into space compared to everything else we've had before, right? In the same way, whether you're talking about the penguins or the tigers, you're talking about human population, or you're talking about the number of tons to orbit, or the amount of mass per orbit, you have the same idea, right? The last few decades here, since 1962, when humans first achieved orbit, the first ever mass to orbit, right? For thousands of years, humans never had a single ounce of anything ever make it to space. We never launched anything to space. In 1962, we had the first, and of course, that is dwarfed over the next 100 years, right? Either we're going to have some sort of catastrophe we can't possibly imagine, and we have a trending down period of mass to orbit, or it hyper accelerates, right? And I think that, the Starship and many other innovations are an emphasis to that these things are here now. These things are here in 2024. Whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter if we like it or not. It doesn't matter if we're an optimist or a pessimist. We have to hope for the best, assume for the worst, and do everything we possibly can to hopefully get that upwards outcome instead of downwards. And this is true with everything, right? Of course, we have people, your smartphones, right? To people in 2024, the smartphone is this incredible idea, right? You have all these tools in your pocket, tools way more powerful than anything in the past of human history. But in 100 years, the smartphone is viewed as ancient technology, right? Like, to us, the smartphone and the and the abacus or a very basic radio, those kinds of things, they seem kind of they seem very similar to us, right? Like, me from 2140 or someone like me from 2140, we wouldn't know how to operate a smartphone in the same way we wouldn't know how to operate technology from the 1700s, right? I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing here, right? You wouldn't know how to sail out to America, and you wouldn't know how to build the very first computers at IBM in 1948, 1949, right? Both of those things are separated by hundreds of years and numerous orders of magnitude, but you've already advanced so far that it's unusable for you, right? So whether it's a smartphone or whether it's the kinds of technology we accept into our bodies, right? Nanotechnology, gene editing, artificial wombs and all these kinds of things. There's so much going to change to diets and to our bodies and to our own personal futures, our own personal stories that I really think it's something to keep in mind significantly. And Bitcoin's an incredibly important part for making sure we align incentives and hopefully result in an outcome that's ideal for all. Now, it's funny because in the year 2020, 21, 24, nobody cares about the fiat price of Bitcoin. And, here, even at this conference and the events surrounding it, everyone talks about Bitcoin price, right? Oh, Bitcoin made an all-time high, or oh, Bitcoin's going up, or this and that, or whatever. But I encourage you and everyone watching online in the future to really consider that there's thousands of years where you have political currency with no exchange rate in Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is worthless in political currency. And now, there was a period where there was an exchange rate, this orange vertical bar here, but then after that, there's going to be no exchange rate backwards, right? There's a very brief period of time where the newspaper and the internet exist simultaneously, and you can go back and forth between them, and they have some comparable relative value to each other. Before the internet, obviously, the internet is worthless in comparison to newspapers and the printing press and just general analog type. And then now, of course, here in 2024, we're roughly 60% internet adoption. Give it another 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to be completely priceless going back, right? And so that's the thing that frustrates me when people talk about the fiat price, quote unquote, or the political currency price of Bitcoin, is that it's a completely temporary nature. And I think if people are obsessed about trying to profit between that or trade between that, they are trying to time a very narrow window slice in human history. And obviously, the more bullish you personally are on Bitcoin, the shorter and shorter that time horizon is going to be. But even within Bitcoin, we have less in common with the future and the past, right? In the same way that everything we have personally experienced, everything you've personally experienced in Bitcoin's history has had some sort of fiat price, and we have less in common with the future with no price than we do with our past. It's the same thing with many other aspects of Bitcoin, right? For the entirety of Bitcoin's history up to this point, 2024, we talk in terms of Bitcoin, right? You talk in terms of Bitcoin, right? But people 100 years from now, 2124, they never talk about in terms of Bitcoin unless they're talking about some nation states or some other mega corporation's balance, right? Besides that, nobody talks in terms of Bitcoin, right? We have less in common with the way we describe the numerical amount of Bitcoin or Bitcoin units, right? We have less in common with the way we try to describe it and articulate it than in the past, right? We're leaving this era where we have commas in front of a decimal place, and we're entering this era where we don't have a decimal place, and we just talk about sats as an underlying unit. Same thing with the store of value mean of exchange, right? Most people in the early days of Bitcoin's adoption, from 2009, 2020s, 2030s, were talking about as a store of value, right? But the reality is that in the future, people primarily, first and foremost, understand it as a medium of exchange. They don't think of it as a store of value until they've thought of it as a medium of exchange, right? So the order at which people learn Bitcoin, you have less in common with the future than the past, right? Instead of learning it as a store of value and then hoping someday it becomes that medium of exchange, most people learn about it by using it, and then they understand it's a store of value. So it's completely flipped directionally in the direction people learn about it. And then I would argue also the single sig versus multi-sig, there's less in common in the future than the past, right? We're in this weird period where everyone that uses Bitcoin has UTXOs, or full UTXOs, where they do base layer one transaction. That's crazy. To someone like me from 2140, that just doesn't make any sense. Everyday people would have a UTXO or do a Bitcoin transaction. That's absolutely mind-blowing, right? Most people never do base layer. Why is it that a cup of coffee or buying a car or even buying a house is so expensive and so worth being on the base layer transaction settlement network for humanity, right? Just do it somewhere on some higher layer, right? Or some other thing that I can't even articulate here or imagine, right? So in the same way, even with the actual ownership of Bitcoin, we have less in common with the future and the past. And again, like population I mentioned, here at this discussion, there's 8 billion people or so. In 100 years, it's 12 billion, right? Well, at least in this period of time, right, people think that, the population is going to fall, right? Late 21st century, human population is going to peak, it's going to start falling, right? We think that's what's going to happen, right? But my argument is that what a lot of people don't understand, at least today, about Bitcoin is that it incentivizes people to build, incentivizes people to have a growing population, right? Obviously, the majority of that population decline is from people having less and less children, from more single-parent households and less stable foundations for people to build on, right? So you're so early to Bitcoin that we're yet to see the beginnings of the inflection, the re-inflection of population upwards, or the growth rate population increasing upwards. So the question is, we like to divide things by how many sats or how much Bitcoin per human, right? But if we're thinking about 100 years from now, when there's 12 billion people or so, and there's 100 billion artificial, quote-unquote, people, let's say, like what happens? We have less in common in the future than the past, right? And how many people have a personal robot that helps them all day, every day? Like some humanoid robot that does their chores. Like, how many people? Okay, one. Good for you. I don't know if that's necessarily true. But where 2140 looks back, it's absolutely insane. What, you didn't have any of these artificial intelligence working for you? You didn't have any? You actually did your own gardening? You actually did this? You actually did that? Like, you didn't have a choice to only work when you wanted to? You actually had to work? That's absolutely insane, right? But where in the future, 100 years from today, even at your current growth rates, if there's 100 billion of these things, whether they're digital or analog, it doesn't matter. If there's all this effort, all this energy, whether intellectual or manual, analog or digital, all this energy chasing more and more production and forcing the marginal cost of production going to zero, you combine all that together, what do you get? Well, if you have less and less Bitcoin, right? Obviously, where we are today in 2024, in this discussion, 5-6 million Bitcoin have been lost. In the future, more Bitcoin will be lost, right? And as a side note, we have less in common with the way the Bitcoins of the future are going to be lost in the past, right? So far, most Bitcoins are lost via hard drives misplaced or seed words misplaced. In the future, most people lose Bitcoin from having unspendable UTXOs. So even the way you lose Bitcoin is different. But if we just assume that we have those 12 billion people or so, we have tens of billions, if not 100 billion or more, of these artificial humanoid efforts trying to produce more energy. If we have that, what is the amount of sats per one of these entities producing energy? It's a pretty straightforward 9,000, 10,000 sats or so, depending how you define it, right? And that's not including a Pareto distribution, a power law, or anything else. My point in sharing this, even if you don't believe me, even if you think that the growth rates are wrong, or they're going to slow down, and this does account for that too, by the way, but even if you think that that's too optimistic, the reality is that the point I'm trying to make is that it's all about living standards. It's not about the fiat price, okay? Today, 2024, if you were to go back in time, there's someone from 1824, like I said before, and explain to them your standard of living, like me. I've come to Australia here, right? A few weeks ago, I was in Portugal for a Bitcoin conference there, and South Africa and Costa Rica before that. My point is, I have a higher standard of living than anyone from 200 years ago, even someone that was one of the top 1% richest people of that era. You have higher standards of living than the Rockefellers and many others of a century ago. They died from diseases that now you just get a shot for, now that you just take some medicine for, now that you just have better health conditions for, right? You have more heating today. You have a higher standard of living than anyone else in the past. My point is that in the same way, someone like me from 2124, a few thousand sats for me, maybe even a few hundred sats for me, is worth so much more than a whole Bitcoin in this period of time, right? It's like this time-traveling energy, as Mike Dunworth says, that where I come from in the future, just a tiny, minuscule amount of sats is worth the same amount as a massive amount of sats today, right? And that makes perfect sense. 100 years ago, Bitcoin didn't exist. It was just an idea in the head of people like Nikola Tesla and Henry Ford, right? So in the same way that it's an infinite amount of sats, got no purchasing power, as time goes on, less and less sats gets more purchasing power. And ultimately, it doesn't matter how many sats you have. It just matters that you hold them. And to emphasize that point, right now, at this period of time, 2024, block reward, 625 million sats. Okay, 100 years from now, it's 9 sats. So I just think that's something very important to think about. I'm 24. I got many decades ahead of me. There's still many cycles after 2024 to 2140 when Bitcoin's issuance stops. And you're going from 625 million sats in the early 21st century to 9 sats in the beginning of the 22nd century. And the last Bitcoin, actually, the last singular Bitcoin, takes the first third of the 22nd century to mine, which in 2024, we still have another 15 years of progress before that is finished. So in the same way that you have 11 sats per human per day, and then you have 5.6 sats each per day issued in 100 years from now in 2024, not including any other artificial human intelligences or energies putting out progress in the world, not including that. My point is, there's someone like me, 100 years in the future, that has a way higher standard of living than anyone in this room. I don't even care if you have 1,000 Bitcoin. Okay, someone like me has a much higher standard of living, much more energy is being channeled for my benefit in consumption and production. And yet someone like me, it'd take me nearly 250,000 years of the amount of Bitcoin being issued per entity per day on Bitcoin's network to get one Satoshi. And here today, you can get 11 today, right? And most of you are spending way more than that on each cup of coffee and each little Uber ride or whatever, which is just crazy that people actually still drive cars. But my point is that in 100 years, people have to explain why anything other than Bitcoin was money. People don't understand money in 100 years. They don't understand how people tolerated that, right? I mean, going all the way back to the discovery of Australia, you know who discovered Australia, right? It was the Dutch East India Company, right? The empire with the first modern, quote-unquote modern, what you would call modern, central bank, that is equivalent to the American dollar or the Australian dollar of the quote-unquote modern world of 2024. There was more in common with today, the modern Australia with the Zoom calls and digital nature, to the Dutch East India Company that discovered it in the first place a few hundred years ago, than to what society is going to look like in just a few decades now. So in the same way that the people in the past can't explain where we are today, we can't explain to people the future why people of the past lived the way they did. So the encouragement is to raise kids well, raise the future generations well, right? People people living in this period of time, their grandkids and the great-grandkids are going to be the people in 2140. Those are the people that are alive, right? And to encourage them to get Bitcoin, to begin allocating to it, and adjusting and preparing for that future world. Whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, the world they're going to live in does not exist yet, right? And then, of course, you have to custody them in mind, right? If you've got 100 million sats, that's a lot of money in 2124, and you're probably not going to have to wait that long to get there, right? So the next adopters are coming, everything is coming, and my encouragement is you are not bullish enough on Bitcoin if you're still thinking of it in fiat price. And if you're trying to conceptualize it even outside fiat price, dividing it by 8 billion humans and this and that and the other, my encouragement is you're still not bullish enough, and perpetually you're not going to be bullish enough, right? People in 2124, when they're trying to quote-unquote predict the future price of Bitcoin, they're thinking in terms of the mid-22nd century or the late 22nd century. They're not trying to think in anything else. So if you enjoy this presentation, if you want to custody it, if you want to custody your Bitcoin in a cloud custody multi-sig vault, of course, this is where I work at Bitcoin Advisor. And my encouragement is that it's not just about Bitcoin. It's not about the numbers themselves. It's about the world we're bringing for the children. It's about what we're teaching them, right? In the same way you'd want to go back in time to 1944, 1924, and warn people then of the optimistic nature of the computer and the horrifying nature of the nuclear bomb. The greatest weapons, the greatest technologies, both for human abundance and human destruction, are ahead of us. And so it's my encouragement to prepare for both of those possibilities, to raise our kids as best we can. And one of the tools for that, as a means to the end of raising our kids well, is for Bitcoin. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.